Opportunity to speak here. It's a little bit tough to follow all of these incredible talks, but I really hope that you at least find this a little bit interesting. So this is joint work with other students in my lab, Christopher Strong and Jean-Chi Lee, as well as some people from Jack Gallant's lab, also here at Berkeley, and his postdoc Tianjiao Zhang. And so the idea for this project came from this really excellent data set that has been collected in the Gallant lab, where they have an fMRI machine where they're able to take recordings of people's neural activity. But in particular, they're able to take these recordings while they're actually participating in an active driving task. And this is really different from a lot of the fMRI data that we typically have in subjects, which tends to be from very passive tasks where they're just looking at images or listening to audio or something like this. And so in this setup, they're actually actively driving in the Carla simulator, which is a fairly realistic simulator, where they are not only obeying traffic laws and sort of navigating through the environment, but they're also actually completing a taxi driver task in a map that's about on the order of a few square kilometers, where they need to actually navigate to specific points in order to complete the task. And we have fMRI recordings of their brain activity while they're doing this sort of complex naturalistic task. And so given that we have this data set, a sort of natural question is, for the models that we have of human driving behavior or just of driving in general, how well do these models predict what's actually happening when humans are driving? And so in order to address this kind of question, we can take the data that we have from this simulator and put it into some possible models or some possible hypotheses about how driving might happen, and then use these features that we get from these models to see if we can actually predict what the brain activity of the human subjects is in that same situation. And so through this paradigm, so we use the voxel-wise modeling framework here, where we make predictions for each sort of discrete unit of measurement that we have in the fMRI recordings to test these hypotheses about different models for driving behavior. And so when we started out looking at this data, the first thing that we tried was classic driving models, which are just based on effectively following the vehicle in front of you. So given your current position and the position and velocity of the vehicle in front of you, should you be accelerating, should you be braking, should you be maintaining your current speed? And so we can compare different sort of classical models for this kind of behavior and use this voxel-wise modeling procedure to get predictions of the brain activity. And this work was accepted to the Learning for Dynamics and Control conference this summer and was led by Chris Strong. And so that's a really neat application of this kind of data set. But as we were sort of thinking about what we might want to do next, we were thinking that these classical driving models don't really provide a complete hypothesis about human driving behavior because they're just operating in this relatively restricted setting where you already exactly know your current state and the current state of the vehicle in front of you. And so it's ignoring a lot of other information about the environment as well as how you're extracting that information to actually come up with these state estimates that you might use to make driving predictions. And so in order to capture some of this more detail about a naturalistic driving task, we have to look beyond these classical models to something that's actually capable of driving from the images that we get from the simulator. And so in order to find some possible models for this kind of more complicated hypothesis, we were looking at the Carla Autonomous Driving Challenge, which is a competition which has been running for a few years now. And in this competition, different models take in images from the simulator as well as LiDAR scans and attempt to follow a series of waypoints to a particular goal, and all the while obeying traffic laws and not colliding with other vehicles and things like this. And in particular, we chose this learning from all vehicles approach here. It was actually the winner of the 2021 version of this challenge, and it's still doing pretty strong on the current version of the leaderboard, and it still has the highest route completion score. So this is what this particular model looks like. It's a deep learning model, so it's taking in these images and LiDAR scans and running them through a series of deep neural networks to predict a final control output, which is a particular acceleration and a steering angle at a particular moment in time. But it's doing this through a series of modules which are completing different tasks in order to get to this final prediction. And the interesting thing about this kind of model is that we can actually extract features from these different modules and compare each of these modules individually with the patterns of activation in the brain. And this is really powerful because from other fMRI studies and from other neuroscience kind of results, we have hypotheses about what different parts of the brain are doing. So we can actually directly compare this with these different modules in an autonomous driving algorithm. And so with this kind of approach, we can ask questions such as, do the neural network activations from this model in fact predict brain activity? And furthermore, do they sort of align with what we think they should in terms of different parts of the brain and different parts of this model? So a first thing that we wanted to check was just that this model is actually, in fact, able to come up with reasonable driving predictions on our collected data set from our human participants who are driving in the simulator. And so I just wanted to show a couple of quick examples of what this data looks like. So on the top row here, we have the input images that the model sees. And then in the second row here, it has a semantic segmentation layer, which is the output of one of the first modules in it. And then it takes this, semantic segmentation version of the RGB inputs and then uses it to paint the LiDAR inputs. So this is just a geometric relationship where each of these LiDAR points is being assigned a color here based on their 3D position in the scene. And then finally, different further modules in the network make a prediction of the bird's eye view, top-down view of the current driving scene, and furthermore make predictions of the future driving behavior of both the ego agent and the other drivers as well. And this is just another example showing that, again, we're able to get reasonable detections and predictions for our data. And so without further ado, I can now show some of the brain activations or, predictions that we are able to get of the brain activity from this model. And I just want to note that these are fairly preliminary results, and in particular, we're still investigating to what extent these generalize to other subjects in the experiment. So definitely take this more as just maybe an indication of the kind of data that or kind of results that we're hoping to be able to see from this experiment. And so first up, we have the semantic segmentation network, which is just taking in these RGB images and predicting this semantic segmentation of the scene. And what we can see here is that in this picture of the brain, what we're plotting here is the prediction score, so the square root of the R-squared correlation between the predictions we get from our model and the actual brain activity that we see in our human subjects. And so what we can see here is that the areas in the visual cortex are being quite well predicted by these features from the semantic segmentation network, which is sort of aligned with what we would expect to see from this kind of part of the network. We also have what we might call an allocentric perception network, which is taking in the semantic LiDAR and then using a point pillar algorithm to splat this onto a top-down grid representing the area directly around the ego vehicle. And then this is passed into a standard convolutional backbone to make the prediction of the bird's eye view semantic segmentation of the scene, as well as the positions of the other drivers. And so again, we can take features from each of these parts and use them to try and predict brain activity. So here is the features from this 2D grid from the point pillar. And then again, a similar plot, this time for the features that we are extracting from this convolutional backbone. And then from the features that we have so far, we can also look at parts of the network that are involved in what we might call egocentric perception. So doing perception directly on the RGB egocentric images that are input to the driving algorithm versus what we might call allocentric perception, which is this more bird's eye view perspective of the scene that is not being directly input to the model, but is being predicted by the model. And what we can see is that the egocentric features are predicting more activity in the visual cortex, whereas other parts of the brain are being better predicted by these more allocentric features. Another part of the network that we can look at is the planning network. So this is what's actually taking in these visual features of what's going on in the scene, and then using that to make some predictions both of the future trajectory of other vehicles as well as of the ego vehicle. And the ego vehicle is what's actually being used to create driving actions when we implement this model to actually do interactive driving as well. And this planning network is just implemented as a series of gated recurrent units that are making the prediction for the future waypoint at each time step for a sequence of 10 time steps going a couple seconds into the future. And when we take the features from each of these units, we're again able to get some predictions for brain activity that are reasonably well predicting brain areas, including the IPS, for example, which is involved in coordinate transformations, as well as some sensory motor regions as well. And then finally, there's one last module to this network, which we might call a hazard detection network. And the reason that we need a separate module for this is that the perceptual inputs that I've been describing so far are really coming from this semantic segmentation version of the scene, which actually isn't encoding any information about things like traffic lights that you really need to know to avoid making violations of the traffic rules. And so in order to get around this, there's a separate network that takes in not the semantic segmentation, but the raw RGB images. And it just needs to output a single binary variable, which is just whether the car needs to brake or not. And if this module says that you need to brake, it overrides the output of the planning module and just makes the car apply the brakes. And again, we can get features from this part of the network and regress them against the brain. And so putting all of these different modules together, we can now get the final plot that I wanted to show you, which is the predictions from each of these modules and the parts of the brain that are best predicted by each of these sets of features. And so I think the main takeaway from this is just that we are in fact able to see a pattern of different parts of this autonomous driving algorithm that is best predicting different sort of distinctive regions in the brain, which is a really exciting result that we're hoping to continue digging into and hopefully have some nice analysis to show for this in the near future. So, thank you.
Questions? How does this heat map look like if you use a network that's not trained for this self-driving test?
So you're thinking of a network that is just trained on like ImageNet recognition or something like that, for example? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we have tried that with this particular data set, but that would be a good baseline to look at. I think most of the results in this kind of area have come from doing comparisons with things like purely vision models. And I guess my expectation would be that it would predict many of the same regions of the brain, since a lot of brain activity is quite dominated by vision. But we would hope to see that our model would be able to predict parts of the brain that a purely visual model would not be able to. But that would be a really good hypothesis to test.
The second question would be, how does the image change if you go from like shallow layers to deeper layers?
Yeah, so we have looked at this as well. It doesn't seem like there's as strong of a trend as we were expecting based on previous work that shows that earlier layers would typically have a higher predictive performance for like earlier parts of the visual cortex. And we're not quite sure why that doesn't seem to be the case in our data. So that's something that we're still looking into.
As a follow-up to that question, is it in part maybe just the scale of the networks? If I follow correctly, with like ResNet APIs for like pattern detection and things, and those are just shallower networks than many of the contemporary ones in vision. So maybe there's just not the range and the features to see these differences, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sorry, so you're saying that the networks that we're using are too shallow to capture this?
Yeah, maybe the layers that are in the span of such a short network really aren't as diverse or as different and increasingly nonlinear as the deeper networks.
Yeah, that's interesting. At least one paper that I'm thinking of was actually trying this experiment in more like the early days of deep vision, when, if anything, it was actually a smaller network than what we're currently seeing in these driving models. But I think maybe a related point would be, as these models or as these networks get larger, the process of actually extracting a reasonable subset of features from them to use in the regression is like an important point of variance between different existing works probably. And that's one of the things that we're currently looking into.
Yeah, and in the older wave of networks, that was like before there were residual as well, and that might have some effect on these analyses. I'm not sure of that detail.
Yeah, so the allocentric perception network was using, and the brake detector network were both using ResNets, but actually the semantic segmentation network was an EarthNet, so there were no residual layers in that. But yeah, it's still potentially like these different architectures could make a difference.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think we're ready for the break. Okay, so we'll be back here at 11.